They're said to be the drug-fueled warriors who can turn into wild animals. They're bloodthirsty pagan fanatics who ruthlessly lead the way into battle.
They're mad, bad and dangerous to know.
They could not be trusted to do anything but kill everything in their path.
Striking terror into the heart of peace-loving Christians across medieval Europe. These are the Viking berserkers.
They had almost superhuman strength.
But it's one lone berserker's last stand on an English bridge in 1066 which has claimed their place in history as one of the most fearsome of all ancient special forces. Just off England's northeastern coast, in Northumberland, lies the holy island of Lindisfarne. It's the holiest place in Dark Ages England. And the scene of one of the bloodiest encounters in the country's history. Home to the Lindisfarne monks, the monastery there is filled with ornate, beautiful, and valuable religious treasures.
People in Anglo-Saxon England, early medieval Europe, they believed in the protection of the saints. So Lindisfarne ought to have been invulnerable.
But what the monks don't know is out to sea, a fleet of strange wooden ships is bearing down on them.
Viking longships roll up on the beach at Lindisfarne. These warriors jump out, and the monks would have been utterly shocked, horrified.
The invaders overrun the monastery. They ruthlessly cut down any man in their path, smashing, grabbing, and looting.
Anything they could pick up and take home. Gold, silver, jewels.
The monks desperately try to hide the monastery's precious artifacts, but they're helpless.
It seems like a lot of the monks had taken refuge by the altar. Some of them were definitely killed there because we're told about the altar being spattered with blood.
The raid on Lindisfarne is brutal and merciless. For the holy men, the arrival of these axe-wielding maniacs feels like a punishment from God.
They would be utterly stunned and astounded that somebody would have the temerity to actually attack God's house.
Those lucky enough to survive the bloodbath are dragged away and taken prisoner. Among them are some of England's most respected religious leaders. They'll be held for ransom. The rest are destined for slavery.
What certainly happened was an unknown number of the monks were taken back to the longships and taken back to Norway, which is where this particular bunch came from.
Slaves were big business. British slaves who were sold as far afield as Byzantium and Baghdad. They would have taken all the slaves that they could.
The The raid on Lindisfarne marks the beginning of the Viking Age.
They said I smell! I had a bath only yesterday!
Today, the Vikings' vicious assaults are a distant memory. Instead, the Vikings have become figures of fascination, and they're not always taken seriously.
You strike me down! That little girl will cry.
With crazy names like Ragnar Hairy-Breeks, Sven Folkbeard, Thorfinn Skullsplitter, and Eric Bloodaxe, they're perfect fodder for enthusiastic historical reenactors. But the reality is, they were intrepid explorers and fearless fighters. Their story begins in the frozen wastes of Scandinavia. Countries we now know as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. At home, the Vikings face some of the most brutal living conditions on Earth. With cold and unforgiving winters and land that's often covered in snow and ice, it can be difficult to grow food. The Vikings quickly realize that if they want a good life, they'll have to steal it. The only way they can do that is to take to the oceans. From the late 700s, Vikings begin attacking places like France, England, Ireland, and Scotland from the sea.
You could certainly see them as entrepreneurs who are taking what might be perceived as a business opportunity to create wealth for themselves. Pure capitalist thinking.
Central to their success is their raiding vessel, the Viking longship. Morten Ravn is a curator at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde in Denmark.
Well, you should imagine people sitting on each of these positions here, which is marked by the floor timbers, and you would imagine them sitting there and having an oar outside the oar holes, which you can also see here, and row the ship. And it would be 26 men on board a ship like this, rowing, 13 on each side.
Clinker-style wooden warships with their characteristic hull shape can carry crews of up to 100 men. Out on the North Sea, the Vikings face freezing cold conditions and vicious waters. As navigation is critical, they use the sun, the stars, the wind direction, and even the color and taste of the sea to help them find their way. But what makes the longships particularly special is their speed. With the use of the sail and oars, they can reach speeds of up to 15 knots. They're light, fast, and with their shallow hulls, they're perfect raiding ships.
They didn't dig that deep into the water. The draft was not that big, which means that you could land the ships, but it needed obviously to be a sandy beach or something like that.
They're vessels that have the same qualities as those used by special forces today.
Viking ships are pretty low profile. They'd be able to beach their craft and deploy it back into the sea to make a getaway with speed or haste.
Cruising Europe's shores in their longships, the Vikings are opportunists. But they don't just attack at random. What the Vikings are looking for is defenseless targets filled with valuable treasures. Remote monasteries and small isolated villages are rich pickings.
They're targeting the most vulnerable people with the most money, which generally means the church.
Like the very best special forces, time is spent in reconnaissance.
It's quite possible that they would sail up to the coast and spot a likely joint and jump over the edge of their ship and attack it.
For people living near the sea, raids that come out of the blue are difficult to guard against.
It was impossible to defend an entire coastline. It's impossible to man such vast stretches of water. You think of the vastness of most coastlines, it's extremely difficult.
Always on the lookout for easy-to-plunder targets, the Vikings developed their own special type of lightning assault.
It's a kind of raid they call strand hog. Come to a village, people are alert, you move on. Find a bit further on, you find there's a village and it looks like everyone's asleep. You run in, grab what you can, get out fast.
Speed, aggression and surprise, it's essential to their success.
But even when their target is identified, the raiders don't just attack recklessly.
The Vikings actually knew, of course, what they were doing when they went out on these raids. They must have had some sort of intelligence knowing where to strike and with what force. You would probably either have scouts ahead knowing where to land, or you would maybe land your troops in not so hostile areas.
The Vikings are careful to guard their backs and ensure that they can get in and away quickly.
With a raid on a monastery, there's probably a certain amount of forethought has gone into that one. You'd hit the beach, you'd need to leave a few people to guard the ships. Ships can be burnt, and you don't want somebody to sneak around and set fire to them. And you probably detail people to go out and cover possible escape routes.
If the mission is going according to plan, victims will have no idea of what's going to happen.
They always have the tactical advantage. It's very, very hard to get one step ahead of the Vikings because you don't know where they're going to go. In some ways, modern piracy has some kind of parallels. But I think in the tactical sense, it's got much more akin really with terrorism.
To make them all the more frightening, they have a simple but brutal array of weapons. The Vikings are famously associated with the axe. The axe head of a typical Dane axe is made of iron and steel. Carefully crafted to be lightweight, fast and well balanced, its blade can be forged to be as thin as just 2 millimeters, giving it a devastating cutting capability. Martin Holtman is a Danish ancient weapons expert.
This is a Dane's axe. It's a typical Viking weapon. You would use this with 2 hands. It's not really hard to lift at all. It's surprisingly light. And you can actually swing it back like this and then move your hands. This way you gain a lot of momentum.
On the battlefield, the Dane axe is used both tactically.
I could take out this axe and hook his leg, and I could just draw him out.
And it's also used to kill.
If you meet someone with this kind of weapon, you better run.
But possibly the most terrifying and deadly weapon of all is the double-edged sword. The most precious of all Viking weapons, it's often passed down from father to son. A Viking warrior would learn technique from an early age.
A Viking sword is made out of steel. The typical weight is around 1 kilogram.
On the battlefield, the Viking sword can dole out death in a number of vicious ways.
It's definitely a slashing weapon for cutting. It can also be used for stabbing.
And if it doesn't kill the victim, it's guaranteed to maim him.
This sword could definitely take off a leg and a hand with ease.
I mean, this is as brutal and as aggressive as warfare can get. You're so up close and personal, and they were using such heavy, cumbersome weapons, which has been utterly brutal.
The remains of Viking victims across northern England show the damage inflicted by the Viking axe and the Viking sword. Their weapons, together with the Vikings' sheer fighting prowess, make them a terrifying prospect for all who encounter them. From the 8th century through to the 11th century, bands of Vikings launch larger and larger attacks on more and more communities. And they don't just use brute force to seize land, gold, and slaves. The Vikings have even more sinister methods.
I'm quite sure that people were murdered and tortured in order to get them to tell where they'd hidden their valuables. There probably was a lot of killing just for the sake of it, simply to create the kind of terror, to cow people, to make them obedient. It must have been a terrifying and violent experience for the victims of Viking raids.
But if the Vikings are the special forces of their day, within their warrior bands, they have an even more elite team, a SEAL Team 6. They're known as the Berserkers.
They were ruthless warriors who would stop at nothing to slaughter their opponents. They were absolutely without fear of injury or death.
They were supposed to have chewed on their shields, howled horribly, went berserk in battle, and could not be trusted to do anything but kill everything in their path.
They're mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
Oh, I'm finding the axe.
Today, Berserkers are objects of fascination, children's fantasy characters. So much so that computer games are built around them. They're depicted as giants, trolls, and ferociously fighting ogres. Painted as superhumans, they're big, powerful, the stuff of legend.
He will have quite often a horned helmet, because even though everybody knows that the Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, it's a brand almost.
But Berserkers were real. One of the strongest bits of evidence as to the existence of Berserkers are these chessmen, discovered around 1831. Found on the Scottish island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, they date from the 12th or 13th century and seem to portray berserkers.
4 of the rooks actually depict warriors biting on the shields, and they've actually physically got their teeth sticking over the rim of the shield. And what they really represent for us is a medieval Scandinavian idea of what a berserker was.
They're also mentioned in poetry or skaldic verse, and in the sagas, the Vikings' ancient historical tales, written between the 9th and 14th centuries.
When you look in saga traditions, berserkers turn up in 1s or 2s, usually if they're brothers, or maybe in numbers up to a dozen. They're not common.
They were professional warriors. Big guys. The best of the best.
part of a Viking king or lord's war band, they're considered elite members of society.
Any boat sailing to England might contain berserkers if it contains members of a king's war band.
Serving as a kind of bodyguard, they're at the forefront of an attack.
They are the core around which an army might be built. They're the ones who will lead the way into battle. When they step forward, everybody else is meant to go with them.
As the most terrifying of all Viking warriors, there is every reason to believe they were even bigger and stronger than regular Vikings. But it's their behavior which they are most renowned for, spawning the English word berserk.
Once they fly off the handle, then there can be dead people lying all over the place before they calm down.
However, it's something else that really sets them apart. The berserkers have unusual ways of preparing for battle. Ancient depictions of berserkers appear to show muscular warriors wearing these skins, complete with the heads of wild animals.
Berserk is thought to have derived from either the Old Norse word ber, meaning bare or naked, or an Old Norse word beri, meaning a bear. So it either means bare off shirt or wearing a bear skin.
The legends say that by wearing animal skins, the berserkers take on special powers. That they can shapeshift and transform themselves into wild animals.
It's a sense of getting into the spirit world, in a sense, and adopting the characteristics of the animal that you're trying to get in touch with.
It is even claimed by some that berserkers are the originators of the werewolf.
Berserkers were not werewolves. Let's start with that bit. People have seen in the berserker a werewolf, somebody who physically changes shape into an animal. What's more likely is that they took on the persona of the animal. They adopted the animal's attributes to carry them into battle, so they went in as strong as a bear or as fierce as a wolf.
You aren't literally going to become a bear or a wolf, but you want to have that strength, that ferocity.
By wearing animal skins and very little armor, the berserker not only lessens the division between himself and the animal he's trying to emulate, it also gives him mystical powers.
They were perceived as invulnerable or able to blunt swords. They couldn't be wounded anywhere that they were wearing these coats.
But the berserker has another secret weapon to help him prepare. And it may very well help him believe in his animalistic abilities. Magic mushrooms.
Their proper name is Amanita muscaria. They're very common. I mean, they're widespread all over the northern hemisphere and up into the sort of subarctic. They're your classic fairy tale mushroom, the bright red with white spots. They're commonly called the fly mushroom or the fly agaric because they're reputed to kill insects.
But the mushrooms also have another effect, which could help a warrior get into the right mental state for a fight.
They have a psychoactive drug inside, which will give you, depending on the dosage, a trip.
The idea that someone could use drugs to prepare for battle is not that far-fetched.
There were cases in World War II where German forces were given amphetamines.
The Nazis developed an early form of crystal meth to help their troops stay alert. In Vietnam, soldiers were issued with amphetamines by the US Army to heighten their senses on missions. But for berserkers, their drug of choice is so toxic, it has to be prepared in a certain way. The mushroom caps are dried, ground up, and made into a hot drink. To aid the process, they're mixed with alcohol.
Presumably in those days it would have been something like mead, something just to wash it down and quickly dissolve the chemicals into the liquid.
It's this practice of stewing the caps in liquid which acts as a catalyst, aiding the body's absorption of the drug. The alcohol will also affect the reaction.
The alcohol will, of course, help the condition. I mean, one of the things we think we don't realise is the mood affects the results immensely, and we've known this for years with other psychoactive drugs. The mood that the person is in when they take the mushroom has an enormous effect on what sort of result they get from it.
Around 30 minutes after the berserker takes his mushroom potion, it's supposed to kick in.
There's a whole host of effects that can be encountered. Common ones are muscle twitching, sweating, salivating, increased production of saliva.
The berserker starts to literally froth at the mouth. Of course, one of the problems, as with all drugs, is they have side effects.
You can get amnesia and fainting with large doses. Nausea is commonly recorded. That's one of the most common side effects. Profuse vomiting. Facial flushing. Often one's sense of balance apparently goes awry.
These side effects are so bad that some suggest that the idea that Vikings took magic mushrooms is a myth.
The one scientific study that's been done in the late 50s suggested that if they had taken magic mushrooms, they probably wouldn't have been fit to fight.
However, some experts disagree.
They've been in use 2,000-3,000 years, probably something on that order. So it's very unlikely that the Vikings would not have known of the mushroom.
And it seems berserkers may have found an ingenious way to avoid any nasty reactions. When the mushroom is passed through the body, it's stripped of some of its toxins.
We know that drinking the urine is one of the commonest ways of diluting the unpleasant side effects and increasing the potency of the chemical.
It means that only one berserker needs to experience the bad reactions brought on by the mushrooms. The other berserkers simply need to drink his urine. This appears to remove the toxic side effects, but leaves the hallucinogenic ones.
I read one report where they thought one would eat it, pass urine, someone else would eat it, someone would drink their urine, and so on, up to 5 times. It may be that one ingestion of the mushroom would actually serve quite a few people afterwards.
It's because of this that mushroom experts are convinced by the use of magic mushrooms as a means of reaching battle fury.
I'd be very surprised if they didn't use them in some of their ceremonies. My own feeling is that that may not have been the sole cause of their enormous strength and aggression, but I suspect it was a definite means of accelerating this process. Pumped full of adrenaline, anger, and I suspect that the mushroom would have been just that added extra.
So, Wearing his wild animal skin and strung out on drugs, the Berserker is almost ready. But there's one final thing he needs to prepare him for battle. Like all Vikings, the Berserkers are religious fanatics. They're utterly devoted to one particular pagan god, Odin.
Odin is the Norse high god. He's the god of war. And Berserkers had the idea that really they were chosen by Odin, that they didn't really choose to be Berserker, that it was Odin who chose them.
Eager to please Odin, an opportunity to fight for him and die for him is a privilege.
For a Berserker, you honoured Odin if you killed someone in battle, and you honoured him by dying in battle. So battle was win-win. What they most wanted was death in battle was a guarantee that you would go to Valhalla.
Valhalla is the warrior's paradise in the afterlife. Like 21st century jihadists, the Berserker imagines that by giving his life in the heat of battle, he'll guarantee great glory and rewards there.
Valhalla is a giant lord's hall in which they feast all night and then they go out of it during the day and they fight all day, preparing themselves for Ragnarok, the final day when all the gods will die.
Ragnarok marks the end of the universe. But for Vikings, being at Odin's side for the greatest battle of all is the ultimate honor. It's the positive welcoming of death that makes the Berserker the most fearsome of all medieval warriors. So, assisted by alcohol, with hallucinogens pumping through his body, with the characteristics of a wild animal entering his psyche, and fully prepared to die in glory, the Berserker reaches Berserkgang, the battle fury. With teeth bared, howling and growling, he faces his opposition.
The howling might well have been chanting of spells behind that shield, getting themselves really stoked up. One of the best modern analogies for it might well be the All Blacks doing a haka. It's designed to be frightening, it's designed to make you feel strong and invincible.
Berserkers have a tremendous psychological effect on their enemy.
I think it would have been very intimidating.
For ordinary peasants like the Anglo-Saxons, reluctantly pulled together to fight, it's horrifying.
They may have probably never been in the battle before in their lives. They really want to live, and they can go back and look after the cows and see their families again. 100 yards away on the other side, there they are howling and biting their shields. They just want to run at you and hack you to pieces.
They got into this very intense and angry, worked up state where they had almost superhuman strengths. And if they were injured, they didn't feel it. They just carried on.
Off their heads with this big dosage of the mushroom, they may not really know what's going on, except that they just attack anyone that's in front of them. Like a loose cannon, you just point it in the right direction and you let them get on with it.
Viking raids across Europe increase, attacking small towns and villages, raping and pillaging. They raze peasant homes to the ground and slaughter entire communities. Eventually, the Vikings bring over their own families to settle in their conquered lands.
Around about 840, this is the point when Vikings actually do start making permanent bases. Instead of going home for the winter, you pull your ships up inside the protection of a rampart, you spend the winter there, and as soon as spring comes, you can get back to raiding nice and early. So it extends your raiding season to about 9 months of the year instead of 3 months of the year in the summer.
With the berserkers at their heart, the Vikings managed to cultivate a vast trading empire. By the 11th century, their conquests stretch from Iceland in the north to the Mediterranean Sea in the south, and from Newfoundland in the west to Constantinople and the Caspian Sea in the east. But it's one event on an autumnal English day in 1066 that will go down in history as the berserkers' finest hour. More than 300 Viking ships carrying as many as 14,000 men approach the northeastern coast of England. Leading them is Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. Hardrada is an outstanding warrior. He's fought in the Balkans and across the Byzantine Empire and has gone on to seize the Norwegian crown. Now, he's hungry for more.
He's got a very clear political ambition, and that is to make good a claim to the English throne.
His target is the greatest city in northern England, York.
The actual Viking army first lands at Scarborough and sacks the town, burns it to the ground to show the local people that resistance is futile. They move into the Humber estuary and then up the River Ouse to capture the greatest prize of all, the capital of the north, York, or in Norse, Jorvik.
York is under English control. But critically, the Vikings had conquered the city exactly 200 years before, and they regard it as their own.
For the Vikings, it's home. So now they're back to claim what they class as their city.
And for Hardrada, York is just the beginning. He believes that if he takes it, the rest of the country will fall to him. After a major victory on the outskirts of the city, York surrenders to him. Hardrada thinks the war is won, that the English crown is his. He's so confident, he's even sent a third of his army back to the Viking fleet, 12 miles upriver. But what Hardrada doesn't know is his nemesis is coming. The newly crowned Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, has heard about the Viking king's intentions. He's hot-footed it from London with an army of some 15,000. Hardrada's Vikings, on the other hand, are bathing in their victory.
If you can imagine a late summer's hot day, the troops have walked 12 miles, probably had headaches from the night before from the revelling. I should imagine quite a few of them would have just laid down on the grassy banks.
There's a relaxed atmosphere in the air. It's warm, sunny, probably sunbathing at the time.
We understand that initially they caught a glimpse of some dust on the horizon, which would indicate a coming of a party.
Hardrada had been expecting the arrival of some dignitaries from York for a simple hostage transfer, securing the city's surrender. What he sees is King Harold and his vast Anglo-Saxon army. Hardrada realizes he's made a terrible mistake.
He's completely dumbfounded and in shock. He didn't expect this at all. And the worst problem he faces now, he has an army outnumbered and also unarmed and under-armoured.
With his troops straddling both sides of the River Derwent, Hardrada needs to regroup. The only way to do this is to get all his men over onto the eastern side of the river via the one and only crossing point. A narrow wooden bridge, so that he can form a defensive line. The majority make it across. But then the Anglo-Saxons appear. It's now that Hardrada turns to one of his special forces. He calls on one Viking berserker. His task, to buy his king time. It's an extraordinary situation. Just one man against an entire army. First, he evokes the spirit of a wild animal. He consumes the stewed Amantia muscaria mushrooms. He starts to feel the empowering effects of the hallucinogen. He believes he has the strength of a wild bear. That with his bear skin as armor, his body will repel the Anglo-Saxon weapons. That he will be invulnerable. Frothing at the mouth, enthralled to Odin, and dreaming of his place at the feasting table in Valhalla, the great warrior reaches the height of his berserk gang and steps out onto the bridge. This one berserker, armed with his Danax, confronts King Harold's 15,000 men.
You can imagine a kind of standoff. He was buying time, giving his life to buy time for the rest of the army.
One by one, brave soldiers from King Harold's army take on the great Viking warrior on the bridge. And one by one, they are cut down.
On a narrow front, probably only one or two men would have been able to attack him at a time. You can imagine that even if he was dispatching people at the rate of one every 30 seconds, he might have held them up for 10 minutes, quarter of an hour or more.
The English body count mounts up.
According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, every person who tries to cross the bridge, over 40 Anglo-Saxon soldiers are killed by this one berserker.
But finally, he succumbs.
The Count Say was finally killed by an Englishman who went down under the bridge with a spear and got him from underneath.
With his death, the Vikings are beaten. Harald Hardrada will die with an arrow to the throat. Despite the defeat, the actions of this great warrior are celebrated in the history books of the day. But there's an irony. The contest at Stamford Bridge may be regarded as the Berserkers' greatest stand, but it also marks the beginning of the end for the Viking Age. By the early 11th century, and certainly by 1066, Berserkers are becoming a dying breed. There's a more powerful force at work than that of the pagan gods. Many Vikings have converted from paganism to a more widely held belief system.
The demise of the pagan berserker comes with the advent of Christianity. Christianity probably had some kind of neutralizing effect. Once you're all part of the same club, then you tend not to attack each other quite the same way.
Years of Viking tradition are slowly eroded.
The Scandinavians begin converting to Christianity in the 10th century. Denmark's the first, Sweden is the last, but even by the end of the 11th century, Sweden is mainly Christian.
Some berserkers cling on to their paganism, but gradually the purity of their military and magical might weakens. Eventually, they will disappear altogether.
In the Icelandic law codes, going berserk is outlawed in the 12th century.
Finally, berserk gang and the rituals which induce it are deemed so degenerate that they're unacceptable in moderate society. Today, the endeavors of the Norsemen still captivate and entertain us. It may be that the Vikings no longer evoke fear and horror as they did 1,200 years ago. But their elite special unit, the Berserkers, do continue to enthrall us. Thanks to a 250-year reign of terror, we can't help but admire their heroism, their iconic, fantasy-like image, and their animalistic, frenzied brilliance on the battlefield.